Hello, welcome back. This week's story is in honor and commemoration of the 100th anniversary that Kenmore was saved from destruction. Unfortunately, we missed it by a few months because it was technically May of 2025, but who cares? It's still an awesome story, and it's 100 years and deserves to be told. Hi, this is Sarah, and you're listening to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really. It was 1883 when Emily Fleming, her maiden name was White, and her husband, Vivian Minor Fleming, moved to Fredericksburg. It was 18 years after the end of the Civil War, and the small town, Fredericksburg, was still scarred by the destruction it received during the Battle of Fredericksburg. After almost 20 years after the war, the remnants of burned homes and buildings with bullet, shell, and cannonballs still lodged in the exterior ran as deep as the scars the residents still held from the scenes they had witnessed. Since she moved to town, she became passionate about preserving Fredericksburg's history and became an active member of the Fredericksburg's Washington Lewis chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. She would become a pivotal figure in preserving Fredericksburg's history during her life here. In my podcast, Fredericksburg Library, Emily is one of the 8 women who fought to save the city's first library in 1894. When she arrived in 1883, she could not have known that without her leadership, Kenmore would have been lost forever. This is the story. In order to go on with the story, we have to go back to the beginning and focus on Betty Washington. Betty was the sister to George Washington, and she and George were both born at Pope's Creek, also known as Wakefield, in Westmoreland County. She was born in 1733. When she was 7 years old, her father and mother moved to the family to Ferry Farms Plantation in 1740. This beautiful plantation ran along the banks of the Rappahannock River directly across from the town of Fredericksburg. At the age of 16, Betty married local merchant Fielding Lewis on May 7, 1750. At the time of their marriage, he was a 24-year-old widower and had 2 kids from his previous marriage. From a prominent family perspective, Fielding was an advantageous match. He was a wealthy merchant and owned a store in town, which is now diagonal from the Fredericksburg Library. He served in the House of Burgess, Spotsylvania Militia, and was a vestryman at St. George's Parish. In 1752, he purchased approximately 1,300 acres in town and asked George Washington to survey 861 of them to build his plantation for his new wife. The home is at 1201 Washington Avenue in Spotsylvania. Now you have to remember that the town of Fredericksburg proper was Sophia Street that ran along the banks of the Rappahannock River. All the streets back were in Spotsylvania. In 1879, after the Civil War ended, it was decided to expand Fredericksburg's limits to what it is today. Kenmore was not named Kenmore until the 19th century when the Gordon family owned it. It's a Georgian architecture that boasts Paris of plaster artwork. This artwork was put in around 1775. The kitchen was a separate building detached from the house, as was common in those days. This was due to the higher risk of fire spreading to the rest of the house. The front of Kenmore today is actually the rear. The front has a beautiful portico added in the mid-19th century and would be looking towards the river. It has a slate roof and a side entrance where the servants would come in and out in between the kitchen and the house. As with all the plantation women, Betty oversaw the day-to-day activities and ran the plantation while Fielding was away. It has been reported the Lewises had over 80 enslaved people working the plantation. Betty was expected to manage farming activities, running the house, ensuring her children were properly educated, attend and host social activities, and tend her gardens. A lot was expected from these women from a societal and economic perspective. Betty bore 11 children, but lost 5 during infancy, so she raised 6 of her own and her 2 stepchildren. With the start of the Revolution, the Fieldings were both strong patriots. War is expensive, and the colonies were already struggling with English tariffs and taxes. Like many of the wealthy patriots, the Fieldings helped personally finance war efforts, with the expectation the Commonwealth would repay them. Betty was a strong supporter of the revolution. From the store, the Lewises supplied clothing, bacon, salt, and other items to the troops. The Commonwealth owed them around 7,000 pounds, and unfortunately, they were never repaid. Fielding died in 1781 after the Battle of Yorktown, leaving Betty in massive debt and little ways to support herself financially. She was 48 as a widow, but she was resourceful. She sold land, hired out her enslaved folks to do tasks, and started a small boarding school in Kenmore to make some money and keep afloat. Her mother, Mary, lived a few streets from Betty in Fredericksburg on Charles Street, so no doubt she saw her mother often. George was also a frequent visitor, and in 1789, Betty suffered another loss. Mary died from breast cancer. George was in charge of Mary's estate, but he delegated to Betty to take care of the logistics. This was a testament to Betty's intelligence and ability to handle business affairs. Betty was able to live in her home for 14 years after the death of Fielding, and in 1795 she moved to Western View in Culpeper to live with her daughter, Betty Carter. Betty died at the age of 64 on March 31, 1797, and was buried at her daughter's property. Her plantation was sold less than a month after her death. Betty had lived in that house for 40 years, at a time where women weren't very educated on things outside of social etiquettes. She proved to be industrial, political, and intelligent from overseeing the running of a plantation, taking care of her children and finding a way to earn money to keep it afloat, and being charged with taking care of her mother's estate for her brother. For such a foundational member of Fredericksburg, she's not well known other than living in George's shadow as his sister. And to those who have visited Kenmore, hopefully a newfound appreciation for her contributions and sacrifice to our city and country will come from this episode. Now, jump ahead. It's now 1922. Kenmore has had several owners, and the property is now on the market slated for commercialization at the price of $30,000, equivalent to $579,000 today. Fredericksburg's Washington Lewis chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution decided they could not stand by and watch the home of a patriot who lost everything to fund the success of American independence be destroyed by commercialization. This group of ladies decided to establish the Kenmore Association and raise the $30,000 to preserve this foundational structure and land. The association believed that every person had the right to be a part of saving Kenmore by becoming a member. With it in place, they set to work to garner up interest and funding. The Daily Star noted, quote, "If this project succeeds and the word fail cannot be found in the vocabulary of Fredericksburg women, the airy, spacious, and attractive rooms of Kenmore will be thrown open to various patriotic organizations and as a depository for historic relics." End of quote. They believed Kenmore belonged to Fredericksburg and every American citizen. The charter was issued on May 7, 1922. Emily was elected president, her daughter Mrs. H. Smith elected secretary, and several other women got to work. Fleming personally wrote hundreds of letters asking for support financially. The biggest boost to her cause was when Calvin Coolidge, at the time vice president, and his wife came to Fredericksburg, and he gave an address in support of saving Kenmore. His address said, "Kenmore is well fitted to rank with the home of Jefferson, Mason, or Lee, or Mount Vernon itself. It ought to be preserved for its own sake. It must be preserved for the sake of patriotic America." And that did it. Funding started to come in, $1,000 here, $1,000 there. And in May 1925, 3 years after starting this effort, Kenmore was officially dedicated as a national shrine, owned and saved by the Kenmore Association. The association was able to raise the $30,000 of all privately donated money, and not a cent of federal or state funds were contributed, which is definitely worth noting. Fleming was honored for her contributions and perseverance at the dedication. But now came the task to raise money for restoring it to its former colonial glory. The 1922 house had yellow paint on the outside that was removed, and an additional wing that was added at a later time was also removed, leaving the two detached structures, the kitchen and what would become the gift shop for a season of time. In 1926, it was reported that the association received several gifts, two of particular interest being a piece of a vest that was worn by Washington himself, given by his great-great-niece, Mrs. Lucy Lewis McConnell from Berryville, and a picture embroidered by a descendant of Betty Washington. Kenmore is definitely a tourist attraction for those that live out of the area. I'm not sure how many local residents visit Kenmore or know much about it, but I can tell you that Kenmore has a personal place for me and in my heart. When I was young in the 90s, I had the chance to volunteer there for a good while, and I got to do archaeology. And it was so exciting. At the time, we were doing archaeology behind the kitchen and would find oyster shells. We found pieces of clay pipe, found marbles, China dolls' eyeballs. I mean, we found pieces of plates. We found so many things. And then we were also doing archaeology. Like I said, the rear is actually the front, and it was on the side of the portico. But I learned so much volunteering there. And I remember at the gift shop, they would used to give out hot tea and ginger snaps when you would come and visit, and it smelled like cinnamon. And when we were there, we would joke around with the people who were on the tour because we were down in the basement. And the rumor is that, Fielding died. He died a poor man, but it was always said that he died over his expenses. So there's talk that there's haunting in Kenmore of listening to Fielding as he was groaning over his financial situation. And so when we were kids, we would take a broom and we would hit it on the ceiling as if somebody was walking. And one of the ladies who was a tour guide at the time used to be like, "Okay, Fielding." And we used to have a good time playing around in there. But the archaeology piece was so awesome. And when I was volunteering, we got to go to Ferry Farms when they had first started to look at the foundation of the house. At the time, there was no house there except this tiny little outbuilding. And it was the same foundation that they built the reconstructed house on today. So I got to be there at the start of that, and it was really exciting and very educational, and I will never forget having the opportunity to volunteer there. So I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope it was new for you. It was new for me to know that it was 100 years ago in May 2025 that Kenmore was saved, and it was this group of ladies who worked so hard to raise $30,000 of all privately donated funding, which is pretty extraordinary, to save Kenmore so we can enjoy it today. So that's it for this week. Until next time. For more information, visit my blog at rebelliouscorsets.com.